Hello students, my name is Wanjiko Kenywa, your lecturer for international security. Today we will be picking up from where we left off last time, and we will be handling collective security as today's topic. Collective security is very important for international security, and the formation of the League of Nations in 1920 is what facilitated collective security as a key international security mechanism. However, it did not begin with the League of Nations. You have to put in mind that, for instance, the Treaty of Westphalia that was signed in 1648 was very instrumental in collective security. However, the collective security within the Treaty of Westphalia was only limited to Europe. Immanuel Kant, in the Perpetual Peace, when he was discussing the Perpetual Peace, he actually had an idea of a mechanism, a security mechanism. In as much as he did not call it collective security, he did suggest that there could be what he referred to as a League of Peace. And if you look at the League of Nations and any other collective security that has come up after the League of Nations, it has shown that the whole idea of collective security is indeed a League of Peace. The collective security is also enshrined in the United Nations. If you look at the Charter, the United Nations Charter, Article 51 talks about collective self-defense. Article 102, on the other hand, talks about joint action to maintain international peace and security. So therefore, you can see collective security has been there for a while. It is not something that came up only with the League of Nations. When Woodrow Wilson was coming up, was suggesting that the League of Nations was formed, he talked about a community of power, where states were supposed to come together. Having come from the First World War, the idea of coming up with the League of Nations was to ensure that all nations which were interested in peace were going to come together to ensure that no more wars are going to be fought. Of course, we know that the Second World War occurred, but at the back of his mind, he had the idea that, you know what, the states were so consumed with fighting one another. And of course, you know, the First World War was the Great War. And after that, the devastation that came about, he realized that states can stop being so consumed with war and instead start concentrating on peace. So the League of Nations, according to Woodrow Wilson, was a way to facilitate states to figure out ways to not just concentrate on the conflicts, on the competition that was there, but rather to come about together for the interest of peace. So the collective security is a machinery for joint action, whereby it's supposed to prevent or counter any attack. Traditional alliances presume a specific potential adversary and were directed against specific threats. So you find that it defined precise obligations to the specific group of countries linked to be shared by shared national interest or mutual security concerns. So you find that with traditional security, therefore, you find that country A and B will form an alliance against country B and C, for instance. So country B and C could be the adversary or their enemy. So with traditional security, you already know who your enemy is. On the converse, collective security, do not know, or you do not have a specific threat. So what happens with collective security is that there are no guarantees that any particular state cannot be an enemy tomorrow, yet they're a friend today. So therefore, you find that with collective security, everybody is a potential friend and everybody is a potential adversary. So theoretically, it is designed to resist any threat to the peace by whoever tries to pose a threat to the international security. So therefore, you find that that's why the motto that collective security operates with is an attack on one is an attack on all. Because what it does is that it acts like almost like a nyumba kumi, let me put it that way for lack of it's almost like a nyumba kumi. So you find that, for instance, in your nyumba kumi, you try to organize yourself in such a way that you're taking care of each other. So in the same, when you're talking about collective security, it's almost similar to a nyumba kumi in the sense that the states are there to protect one another. They're supposed to cater to each other's security concerns. And so therefore, you find that with collective security, as I had given the difference with traditional security, is that even within a nyumba kumi, you might have a potential threat in your nyumba kumi. So in the same way, when it comes to collective security, everybody is a potential threat and everybody is also a potential enemy. Collective security has also been linked to collective defense. However, there's some differences between the two. Collective defense is a form of alliance comprising of nations with a common perception of threat to their security or a common enemy. So collective defense is a form of tradition, is a form of alliance. However, the difference here comes about where you find that it is mainly a regional defense system which only covers members who are a part of the defense system, and they also still have a common enemy. So a good example of a collective defense system will be NATO, which was formed in 1949, and then the Warsaw Treaty Organization, also referred to as the Warsaw Pact, which was formed as a response to the NATO. And if you look at it currently, one of the key common threats that the NATO member states face is Russia. So therefore you find that when the states are coming together, the states that are under NATO come together, they already know who their potential threat, not necessarily enemy, who their potential threat is. And remembering again that collective security and just the whole securitization idea is an element of, it's a deterrence measure. So even when you're coming to collective security and collective defense, one of the key things that brings in a similarity in the two is that it acts as a deterrence measure. The only difference being that for collective security, everybody is a potential threat, everybody is a potential friend. With collective defense, on the other hand, you already know who your threat is, or who your enemy is. So you find therefore that with collective defense, the possible threat is known by anyone. However, with collective security, anybody is a potential threat. Collective defense again is a balance of power strategy, whereas collective security is not a balance of power strategy. A balance of power, remembering, is all about maintaining the status quo of power. It's almost like, it's not a seesaw whereby you're trying to ensure that everybody has the same type of power. Balance of power is a way for, especially for the powerful states, to maintain their status quo of power. So therefore, when you're talking about balance, collective defense being a balance of power strategy, if you look at the members of NATO, if you look at the members of, and even the former members of the Warsaw Treaty Organization, which of course is no longer there, you find that it is a way of ensuring that they maintain their security, which by maintaining their security, it has a direct impact on their power. So therefore, it is a balance of power strategy also because one of the key balance of power mechanisms we have is armament and disarmament. And so therefore, you find that by coming up with a collective defense system, it means that the countries that are part of the collective defense system, one of the key things they do is that they ensure that they arm themselves, they train together, and so by so doing, it has a direct effect on their power. So the common enemy that they have in this case, for instance, or the common threat that they have in this case for NATO would be Russia, for instance. You find that by them coming together, they are able to maintain their balance of power. They're able to maintain their status quo as powerful nations. Let's go into the theories and how the theories relate to collective security. I will be concentrating on two key theories, that is liberalism and realism, and we'll begin with liberalism. Of course, remembering that when the League of Nations was formed, or when the League of Nations, the idea of the League of Nations came about, the key theory or the key philosophy that guided it was liberalism. And if you remember again, when even if you look at the key scholars and the key proponents of liberalism, one of the key proponents is actually Woodrow Wilson. And the whole idea of him facilitating or encouraging the League of Nations to be formed was, after coming from the First World War, they imagined that we could live in a world where there is peace, that countries will not be so drunk with power and so drunk with competition and so drunk with trying to securitize, but instead they could find other ways to actually work together. Instead, they could prioritize themselves and become, the agenda of the day will be peace rather than going to war with one another. So therefore, liberalism is quite optimistic about collective security, and even liberalism as a theory in general is quite optimistic. And so when it comes to collective security, liberalism looks at collective security as fostering cooperation and interdependence. Because you see, when you're working together, I earlier gave an example of nyumba kumi. When you are in a nyumba kumi, if it works, that is, for you in your nyumba kumi, you're forced to know who your neighbor is. You're forced to sort of work together. You're so forced to depend on one another. That is the same thing with collective security, because countries here are find themselves having to cooperate with one another, find themselves having to be interdependent with one another, of course, in terms of security. So therefore, conflict is not the only thing that shapes their interaction. They can also concentrate on other things such as cooperation. And you find that once they start cooperating on security matters, it therefore becomes very easy for them to also start cooperating in other areas. Another thing is that collective security acts as a deterrent measure against errant states. And these errant states can be any state, again, remembering that collective security, everybody is a potential threat, everybody is a potential friend. And so therefore, anybody who has an idea or an inkling to cause war or to cause conflict will be reminded that an attack on one is an attack on all. And the moment they remember that, then it acts as a deterrence measure, because they will be somewhat afraid, if not totally afraid, that the other states are going to rise up and actually work against them. So that's how it ends up deterring the errant states from actually acting up. The other thing is that it maintains the status quo of peace. And remembering again, liberalists really love peace. Liberalists talk about, let's not go to war. Let's figure out ways to work together. Let's figure out ways to cooperate with one another. So it's almost as though they're trying to divert states' attention from always competing, always going to war, always, being hyper vigilant. They want to ensure that states look at peace as an alternative. They want to ensure that states look at peace as the only and the best alternative. So therefore, you find that the status quo of peace becomes very important for states. And then finally, you find that by virtue of liberalism propagating collective security, it ensures that international law and international organizations, their prominence is maintained. And how they do this is this way. A lot of the times you find that collective security, one of the key institutions that facilitate collective security is international organizations. And one of the key things that also ensure that there are rules and regulations that foster or that guide states on how they interact with one another is international law. And so you find therefore that international law and international organizations become a very key institution, are a very key ingredient in ensuring that collective security is successful. Because you cannot, for instance, talk about, in this day and age, you cannot talk about collective security, for instance, and not talk about the United Nations. You cannot talk about collective security and not talk about the African Union. So you find that these international organizations are very, very important, because again, at the basis of what international organizations facilitate is cooperation and interdependence, which, as I mentioned a little earlier, is a key ingredient of making collective security to be successful. Realism is the other key theory that discusses collective security. And in true fashion of what realism is, it's quite pessimistic. It's quite pessimistic because, remembering, if you even look at all the theorists and all the scholars who've discussed realism, such as Thomas Hobbes, they are quite pessimistic of human nature. They are quite pessimistic that, that they are quite pessimistic in how they look at the world, because by virtue of them believing that human nature is selfish, human nature, we are just driven by our passions, human nature. And remembering again, states are formed by human beings. So, and in fact, it reminds me of what I believe it was Plato who was saying, that states are not made of oak and rock. It's not like a building where, your building is made of metal and glass and all these other things. And then once you have the stones and the glass and you put them together, you say that's a building. A state is not made up of trees. A state is not made up of all these other things you see. A state is made up of the essence of the people who are in it. So when realists are talking about the fact that they feel that human beings are evil, that human beings are driven by passion, that human beings are competitive in nature. So in the same way, states which are made up of human beings, by the same nature of the people who are in them, are also competitive, are also selfish. And that's why you find, therefore, that realism is quite pessimistic, and also quite pessimistic in general, and also quite pessimistic of collective security. And this is what realism talks about when it comes to collective security. Number one, it argues that there's no automatic harmony. And because there's no automatic harmony, you know, first of all, these are countries, or these are institutions, or these are political actors who are already intrinsically competitive with one another. So therefore, by the virtue, it's not that it denies that collective security is not there. It is very aware that collective security is there, but it says that it's not something that comes out automatically. So therefore, you find that states therefore force themselves to actually be part of a collective security mechanism, because it's not in their nature. It's not in their nature to be automatically harmonious. Secondly, is that the actor's motivation to join a collective security mechanism is very egoistic. If you look at just that word egoism or egoistic, just from what we know about ego, when you're talking about somebody who has an ego, somebody who feels themselves, you know, somebody who is very selfish, somebody who only thinks about themselves. So in the same way, just the same way human beings can be egoistic and selfish, states can also be egoistic. So when they're joining a collective security mechanism, their motivation is not the antonym or the opposite of egoism is altruistic. They're not doing it because it's a wonderful thing to do. They're not doing it because, you know, it is the blessed, and they're doing it because at the end of the day they're quite selfish. There's something they want to get out of that collective security. And in fact, remember at the beginning of the class I talked about the defense dilemma. Because at that particular point, states realized that their national security was not enough to guarantee their security. So they had to find out other ways, or a plan B that can supplement their national security. And so the plan B became collective security. So when I talk about actors, the political actors, and in this case their states, are quite egoistic, or their motivation is egoistic, is that their actions and preferences are based on their assessment of their own welfare and not that of others. State actions are not altruistic. The third thing is that survival is the immediate goal and coexistence is a tactic. And that is what Kissinger in his book Diplomacy talks about. Because again, going back to this idea of egoism, they realize that yes, states have an army. Most states have an army, not all states have an army. And yes, they can rely on their national security, but sometimes the national security can fail. And so as a plan B or as an insurance, then collective security becomes that for them. And so survival is the immediate goal. And again, that brings in the idea of egoism. So survival is quite an egoistic endeavor. So coexistence just becomes a tactic. So states become quite rational. You know, when you're rational, when you're trying to make a decision, you try to weigh the consequences of your choices. When you're trying to make a decision, you try to see what will work best for you. And sometimes if you know that within yourself, you do not have the full capacity to guarantee your own security as a state, then it becomes important to figure out other ways to get insurance for your security. Of course, it does not mean you abandon your national security. It does not mean you do away with your military or what have you. But it means that for your own survival, it's important to sort of figure out a way to have insurance over and above your national security. The other thing is the role of reciprocity. Now, reciprocity is a key ingredient of how international organizations work. Remembering, international organizations, when we were discussing liberalism, was one of the key institutions that facilitate collective security. So when it comes to reciprocity, it acts as a tit for tat. So what happens is that I will behave so long as you behave. If you do not behave, then I will not behave. So it's almost as though countries are checking on one another. So collective security only works because of reciprocity. And then you find there's also self-preservation. They are trying, again, this goes back to the whole idea of, you know, human beings and states to a large extent are quite selfish, and they're quite, you know, we're always looking out for ourselves. So you find that human beings naturally have enmity and distrust of one another. So in as much as they're in a collective security, and in as much as everybody is a potential friend, they are very aware at the back of their minds that everybody is literally a potential enemy or a potential threat. So they're not there to make friends. They know very well that anybody can be your friend today, and tomorrow they can be your enemy. So for collective security to work, there are key things that it must fulfill. Number one, everybody must be convinced that it is important to maintain the status quo of peace. Everybody must be keen to ensure that, you know what, let us not just be drunk with power and competition and going to war with one another. Let us also try to ensure that there is peace. So the status quo here is peace, that every state should be interested in maintaining peace in the international system. The second thing is that all states must fulfill their obligations in good faith. The obligations could be anything. It could be peacekeeping missions, it could be remitting money to the international organization. So you find that these are some of the things that facilitate collective security. There should also be certainty of collective action. Remember, an attack on one is an attack on all. So if members are not convinced that an attack on one is an attack on all, they're not going to feel secure in a collective security mechanism. The other thing is that the collective security mechanism must be strong enough to cope with a combination of power. So here you ask yourself, for instance, if Kenya and Uganda decided, for example, to fight Tanzania, will Tanzania be safe? Chances are that yes, because the entire world will come together to help Tanzania. What if Germany and US decided to attack, let's say, Kenya? Will we be safe? Think about it. A lot of the times, majority of the time is that we might not be quite safe because that combination is quite strong. So you find that, again, this is just the basic requirement. Does not mean that everything has to happen the way it's indicated on paper, but that is the assumption that states actually have. Another thing is that it requires voluntary association, and that's how, you know, the League of Nations was formed, that states decided to come together under the League of Nations. And then countries must commit not to act unilaterally. And again, if you look at the United Nations, countries, in as much as a sovereign nation, you have every right to defend yourself, you have every right to maintain your national security. You're not supposed to be so quick to jump at the opportunity to wage war. At the end of the day, it expects you to really sit down and rationalize the whole process and realize, you know what, conflict is not the only way. You can find out other ways to sort out your issues. For instance, diplomacy, which is again one of the things that collective security facilitates. That let war be the last measure of last resort. Try other mechanisms such as diplomacy, mediation, arbitration, any other mechanism, but just ensure that war is the last resort. Now, as with everything, I remember liberalism indicated the best of collective security. However, there has been a critique of collective security, and this does not mean that it does not do a good job. I mean, look at where we are right now. Yes, after the formation of the League of Nations, they imagined there will not be another war. We still had the Second World War, and after the Second World War, they formed the United Nations and imagined we will not get another war. Then we had the Cold War. There were rumors of another third world the other day, although it did not happen. But at the end of the day, you have to give credit where it's due, that collective security has indeed tried. However, collective security has its shortcomings, and these shortcomings are critical because at the end of the day, we do not do critical if we do not critique something, it means that there is no room for improvement. So the critique comes in whereby, number one, the international system is quite anarchical. And what we mean by this is that we do not have an overarching power. We do not have a world government or a world police. Yes, the United Nations tries to act as the world government and tries to act as the world police. And also the US tries to do that. But at the end of the day, states being sovereign and states always being selfish and egoistic will still do whatever it is they want. So the fact that there's no overarching power, there's no country or there's no power to effect collective security. Another thing is that states can never perceive threats identically. Remember that security is a social construct. What is a threat to you may not be a threat to me. Maybe I fear snakes, you don't fear snakes, for instance. So there's no way, therefore, you expect that in the same way you do not expect states to look at a threat similarly. So for instance, Somalia is a key security issue for most states, but it is more real to Kenya because, number one, of our proximity, because of Al-Shabaab, and so many other things that come up. But it may not be a threat as much to maybe a country like Barbados. So you therefore find that security cannot be looked at identically, so you do not expect countries to behave in the same way to a threat. Another thing is that not everybody is interested in peace. Not everybody. We still have, just because collective security acts as a deterrence measure does not mean it has completely removed the idea of threats. There are still countries which pose threats. There are still countries. And remember again, war is a continuation of politics. So countries can choose to become errant, can rationally choose to become errant, because at the end of the day, it's going to have an impact on their power. Another thing is that human nature is to war. Remembering we talked about realism, and this critique is majorly based on realism. So because human nature is to war, we are led, you find that human beings are led by their passions. And if you're led by your passions, it therefore means that the chances of you going into conflict with one another are high. So in the same way, states are led by their national interest, and they're led by competition. So the chances of going to war are higher than them cooperating with one another. And so you find that collective security can therefore not work according to ideal conditions. You cannot just imagine that, just because an attack on one is an attack on all, it means that if country A is attacked, then all the other countries will come to join. Because if you remember correctly, when Rwanda was going through the genocide, for instance, the world stayed for almost 100 days without doing anything. And you would imagine that the world would have acted faster. But one of the reasons they did not act fast was what? Because it was not in their interest. So why bother with a small country somewhere? So you find therefore that the idea, the conceptualization of an attack on world, or this idea that the world will come to save you or to help you, does not always actually work. Another thing is that collective security is organized in such a way that the victim and aggressor are in the same outfit. Remembering, everybody is a potential threat, everybody is a potential aggressor, is a potential friend. So it means therefore that today we are friends, but tomorrow you might be my enemy. It's almost as though you're expecting sheep and foxes to live together. I mean, at the end of the day, the sheep is going to eat the sheep is going to be eaten by the fox. And so therefore we cannot imagine that just because, for instance, some countries or majority of the countries are in the United Nations, you imagine therefore that we are not going to go into war, or there's not going to be any conflict. So you find therefore that collective security is not a guarantee that there's going to be, the threats are going to be completely removed. The other thing is that multilateral institutions, that is the international organizations, do not always work. And we've seen an example of the United Nations failing several times. Again, it does a wonderful job, but at the end of the day, there's no decisiveness with it. And then the other thing is that there's no moral and social pressure. At the end of the day, states are led by their national interests. So they are not led by their conceptualization or their need for peace. They are led by their national interest. The other thing is the security dilemma. And remembering that power is zero-sum. So countries are always arming themselves, and countries will not stop arming themselves. And so therefore this means that just because you have collective security, it does not mean that countries will stop arming themselves. If anything, sometimes it actually prompts them to arm themselves more, because remembering, in as much as we talked about the balance of power, armament and disarmament, this whole idea of, weapons against mass destruction, weapons and nuclear weapons and all these other things, the same countries that are telling you not to arm yourself already have those weapons. So at the end of the day, it's just that they're checking on you, but they're not checking it on themselves. So they maintain their power. And then you realize that the collective security mechanism, especially under the League of Nations, was a fragile compromise between American utopianism and European paranoia. So it was just them trying to figure out how they were going to rebuild themselves after the First World War. It was just a way to try to find a way to fulfill their dreams. Of course, a lot of good has come out of collective security, but at the end of the day, you realize that it also has had its shortcomings. So that is the end of our class today. We will see you next time. Thank you.
Televised lectures supplement our robust online learning going on our MKU online platform. You can view more on our televised lectures via our online platform. We are in a digital era, and Mount Kenya University knows this. The following are the steps to follow so as to complete your online application. Download the application form from the website www.mku.ac.ke. Attach copies of your academic certificates and ID. Pay the application fees via M-Pesa pay bill number 270988. Your ID is the account number. 2,000 shillings is the charge for a postgraduate. You can also deposit in the bank accounts provided on the website. Then email all the above to apply@mku.ac.ke.